All right, hello and welcome everyone. So you wouldn't know it just from watching the video, but I've been trying to get this video made for about a week, and I had all kinds of trouble with traveling. And then I've got this nice new MacBook Pro laptop that doesn't have the same connections as every other charger, and so all my other devices have the same chargers, as you might imagine. And then this new one has these different ports, and so on the road I brought the wrong charger, and I had filmed the first collection of these videos using that thing, and I didn't want to start over from scratch, but I also want to make the video. So anyway, what I've done is I've compiled those together. And so the first part of the video starts off like this, and it actually turns out the place where I leave off in the very end is actually a good starting point for the video. So I'm just going to kind of skip down right here, and I'm going to begin with so this is a key term study guide. I'm going to begin with key term study guide, or with this part. This is like 45 out of just over 50 or so. I'm going to start here because this is actually a pretty good place to start the video anyway. And then I'll just leave off at, I guess, 44 at the end of the video once I merge together all the files I had already. All right, so here's our 10 principles, the really kind of key important ideas for economics. Firstly, supply and demand is a powerful tool to describe and predict outcomes. Free markets are an efficient way to organize economic activity. I'll talk about these once I go through them. Government can sometimes improve free markets. Price elasticity is a concept known by smart CEOs. Profit maximizing managers think on the margin. Strategy should involve the central question: how do I obtain long-run sustainable profits? Irrationality is commonplace. GDP is a measure of economic well-being. Inflation, unemployment are measures of economic misery. Economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable, and the government can play a role in stabilizing the economy. Trade is not a zero-sum game. Overall gains exceed the overall losses. That last one I think is actually like a key important principle for like understanding mainstream economics as a whole. People get the sense that you think of, well, you have some people that are fabulously wealthy, some people that are fabulously poor, and you have this feeling that maybe the winners have won because they've stolen something from those who have lost. And absolutely, like that can definitely happen, and that can certainly happen in any economic system, least of all in a capitalist system. However, there's nothing about markets, there's nothing about economics per se that makes it a game of winners and then losers on the other side. Actually, under like the right assumptions, and when care is taken to construct markets in a good way, we get a situation where the division of labor, comparative advantage, creates the scope for gains from trade in the way that makes everybody better off. And that's the idea, is that trade, economic activity in general, makes people better off. That's the story of recent human history. That's why we see through the Industrial Revolution and these gains, we see standards of living rising, workers becoming increasingly productive, and there's a separate discussion about whether those gains are evenly or unevenly dispersed throughout the economy. Very often this is tied to productivity, and then you think about like opportunities to become a very productive worker, and there's a whole philosophical and other sort of normative discussion and debate that goes down those paths. My point is just basic economics and market reasoning gives us a situation where everybody can be better off as a result of economic activity. Then, when that ends up not being the case, and when you end up having exploitation and so on and so forth, well, now there's a reason, and now there's a motivation for policymakers, be it governments or non-governmental organizations, to get involved and say, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? Maybe we can rectify some of these inefficiencies. All right, so the first thing, supply and demand is a powerful tool to describe and predict outcomes. Basic idea is like, yeah, the supply and demand model rests on some actually pretty restrictive assumptions. That we've got a competitive market. There's many buyers, many sellers, take the price as given. And so it's actually incorrect to use the supply and demand model to think about like iPhones, because Apple is not operating in a perfectly competitive market. That said, the basic ideas, like the intuition behind supply and demand fluctuations, thinking about, if there's an increase in demand, well, now you've got consumers competing with each other to obtain relatively scarce items that competes up the price. Or think of like a decrease in supply. Now you've got less of whatever is the product in the market, and we'd expect the price to be competed up. Or if you have a decrease in demand, you can think of this as consumers losing interest in the product and now the willingness to pay, therefore the market price falls. Again, we think of consumer willingness to pay as being measured by the height of the demand curve for that marginal item. I've got a separate video that thinks about interpreting supply and demand model. I think it's like Supply and Demand Explained or All About Supply and whatever it is. You can go and find that video, and it kind of explains the background of the supply and demand model, which I think is really useful. For the supply standpoint, if you increase the supply of the item, now you've got relative abundance. And if things are plentiful, we expect the price to fall, other things equal. And it turns out you can apply those four ideas, thinking about directional changes in supply and demand in conjunction with each other, and thinking about actually relative abundance and relative scarcity as a good way to get a sense of whether we think price will rise and fall. Like, as a result of the pandemic, right? We had people stockpiling toilet paper and paper towels, because who knows? But anyway, we could think of like what's happening in this market. We have prices rising. We maybe have a higher quantity that's traded or not. If we want to determine what's going on in this market, what we'd want to do is we'd want to actually observe, okay, what happened to the market price? What happened to the market quantity? If it turns out that we observe the market price rising and the market quantity rising, at least in the short run, we could conclude that what's happened is the demand has increased, at least at a rate faster than supply would have either increased or decreased, right? So getting an increase in price and getting an increase in quantity demanded, or equilibrium quantity, happens when demand increases. You could have other things happening. Maybe the price rises, but the quantity fell. How can that happen? Well, you can draw your supply and demand curves and see what is going on when we have a situation where the price rises but the quantity falls. Oh, it's got to be the case that we have a decrease in supply, right? A leftward shift to supply is going to lead to a higher price and a lower quantity. And so if we have observed a higher price but a lower quantity traded, now we know that regardless of whatever happened with demand, we know that the effect on the supply was the stronger story. And it's that way that you can get closer to actually using the supply and demand model in practice. As a matter of fact, I've got a video that thinks about actually two videos, thinking about actually using the supply and demand model and how you can take this otherwise kind of like Econ 101 textbook example or textbook model to make actually powerful predictions and inferences in terms of what's happening in actual markets. Free markets are an efficient way to organize economic activity. Yeah, that's right, always and everywhere. However, if we end up having incidents of market failure, right? So if you have market power, if you have asymmetric information, if you have externalities or anything else that's going to cause the market to fail to operate efficiently, now you've got, and this could be government regulation or whatever, now you've got a situation where the market's going to lead to an inefficient outcome. However, if we have the assumptions necessary for a free market, where indeed the Adam Smith invisible hand actually coordinates economic activity, we expect we're going to get the efficient outcome. We're going to get goods and services directed to those who are willing to pay the most for them, who value them the highest, and we're going to have production performed by the efficient, the low-cost firms. Now, the first part that I said is a little bit controversial, saying that we're going to have allocative efficiency. We're going to have goods and services directed to those who are willing to pay the most for them. There's a separate question there, which is if ability to pay is strongly correlated with willingness to pay or not. It could be the situation where somebody who doesn't have a whole lot of money actually values the good higher than somebody else who's pretty well off, but isn't willing to pay a lot for it because they simply don't have the ability to pay. Actually, some of those ideas I will explore in my ethics and economic behavior course this fall, which I will put the videos for here on my YouTube channel, and you'll be able to follow along if you're interested. All right, so government can sometimes improve free market outcomes. Oh, so I said free market can sometimes be an efficient way to organize economic activity if we have those situations where there's market failure. If you have market power, like a monopoly, if you have externalities, these are additional effects that befall bystanders, or if you have asymmetric information, which leads to the problems of moral hazard and adverse selection, which I discuss in this video and then in some other videos I've got. If you have any of those things present, definitely we might expect that government regulation, taxes, tariffs, price controls sometimes could possibly lead us back to a better market outcome, better from the standpoint of improving market efficiency. Basically, government intervention is good in the situation, or could be good in the situation where the market's already failing. Government intervention is very bad in the situation where the market's already giving us the efficient outcome. So then it requires competent and careful policymakers to pay attention to what level of intervention is warranted. Sometimes the role of the government should simply be to provide the foundation, the stability for the economic activity to take place. Other times, it's necessary for the government to become involved, and this might be done counter to efficiency concerns if we're interested in promoting societal goals of equality, for instance. That might be a reasonable situation under which we'll trade off economic efficiency for the goals of equality, especially if we believe that might lead to greater efficiency in the future. All right, so price elasticity of demand is a concept known by smart CEOs. Basically, this is the idea that there's responsiveness to changes. In particular, price elasticity of demand price elasticity of demand is literally defined as the percentage change in quantity demanded per a percentage change in price. It's basically the idea that if we change our price, how is the quantity, how are consumers going to respond? So let's just consider an increase in price. We know by the law of demand at higher prices, we're going to get a lower quantity demanded. But then the question is, and what elasticity offers is a way to understand how much less is demanded. So if price rises and demand falls by a more than proportional amount, we'd say, well, demand is really responsive, really elastic. But if price rises and demand falls by a less than proportional amount than the price change was, we'd say demand is really inelastic. Turns out, if demand is elastic, you'd want to lower prices to raise revenue. If demand is inelastic, you want to raise prices to increase revenue. The reason why is because revenue is just price times quantity. And then the thing that we want to pay attention to is that product of price times quantity. Is that getting larger or smaller when we're getting an increase in price or a decrease in price? And it has to do with how the quantity aspect is responding. Now, of course, we should be paying attention to maximizing profits, not maximizing revenue. But this gets us in a direction that's useful. Also, there's other elasticities we might care a lot about, like income elasticity, thinking about how changes in income affect changes in quantity demanded, and that's relevant during times of recession or economic expansion. Another thing we might be really interested in is how the changes in the price of related goods, like our rivals or those who are producing goods that our consumers use along with our goods, complements, might be relevant, and that's the cross-price elasticity of demand. All right, profit maximizing managers think on the margin. This is the idea of comparing the additional benefit versus the additional cost of doing one more unit of the activity. And that's just our marginal benefit versus marginal cost, or MR equals MC condition for profit maximization. Strategy should involve the central question, how do I obtain long-run sustainable profits? Oh, this is going back to like Warren Buffett's idea of moats, which I'll talk about going back to, which will be in the future in the video. The idea is you want barriers to entry if you want to protect economic profits. And the idea is anytime there's positive economic profits, rivals are going to be interested in coming into the market to capture some of those economic profits. So you want barriers to entry that reinforce things like product differentiation and protect the market more generally. And one important observation is that we don't expect that there's going to be any completely 100% impenetrable barriers to entry. We're going to expect that in the very long run, even the strongest of monopolies are going to lose footing to rivals that come in or rival technologies. For instance, IBM used to be a massive monopoly. They're still around. They still have market power. Watson is a very exciting technology, but Microsoft and Amazon and Google are all much stronger firms than IBM. All right, so rationality is commonplace. This is the basic idea that we expect decision makers to be rational, meaning that they'll seek after their own interests. But this is kind of like entering the realm of behavioral economics, realizing that people make errors, people make mistakes, emotions matter, people have self-control problems, and so on and so forth. And so this being the case, this introduces inefficiency into the market and creates a situation where entrepreneurs or businesses can either benefit from the inefficiency themselves or help people make better outcomes, especially in the healthcare realm. So a really interesting idea is the idea of nudging. Nudge. So this is introduced by Cass Sunstein Richard Thaler, who won the Nobel Prize recently, and then Cass Sunstein, both at the University of Chicago. And interestingly, that book called Nudge It's a lot of kind of Thaler's research, which focuses a lot on like finance and behavioral finance and so on and so forth. But the idea is really good. If you're actually interested in one of Thaler's books, I'd recommend Misbehaving before Nudge. The first half of Nudge is awesome. The second half actually lost my interest. I never finished it. But Misbehaving was wonderful, and that's kind of a good introduction to thinking about how you can create a structure that can guide consumers or make decision makers perform better. We see this all the time. We see businesses trying to guide consumers in the direction that they're looking for. So for instance, like years ago, I haven't been in a mall in decades, but I think that might actually be correct. At least a decade. I don't know about decades. Think of like a movie theater. You smell the odor of popcorn, or think about like walking past like Abercrombie and Fitch or Hollister, kind of pumping their cologne so that people would smell it and then hopefully kind of walk into that store. Well, these are ideas of trying to steer people towards making the decision that the firm is interested in. You could think of grocery stores putting the items that people are looking for kind of at the back of the store, so you have to go past everything, or putting like candy in the aisle so you make this impulse purchase right as you're checking out, or this sort of add-on items. These are all ways where firms kind of take advantage of some of the propensities of consumers to increase profits. But you could think of like the more positive applications of behavioral economics to help people to make decisions that are good for themselves. And there's kind of substantial scope in healthcare for that, especially. GDP is a measure of economic well-being. Inflation and unemployment are measures of economic misery. Yeah, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced in an economy in a given time period. So it's literally like the market price times the quantity of goods, and then aggregating up across all goods in the economy. And so GDP is a measure of the value created, and then presumably there's some distribution of this value, hopefully tracking pretty close to productivity of workers, and so on and so forth. This is a measure of the value created. This is like correlated with standard of living. Inflation and unemployment are kind of the opposite. Actually, at high levels of GDP, we expect high levels of employment, low levels of unemployment, because more workers and more resources are required to produce those goods. If GDP falls, there's a low level of economic well-being, high level of unemployment, there's misery. Inflation, well, inflation is not as threatening as people tend to think it is. A lot of the problems with inflation end up with people kind of doing silly things to try to avoid inflation, at least from the standpoint of like moderate, predictable inflation. If there's high levels of inflation, like hyperinflation, that's a completely different animal entirely. Inflation and unemployment kind of mixed together it actually gives rise to the misery index, which I believe is from Okun, O-Q-U-N, famous economist. And so that's interesting to kind of think about, as like the actual impact of macroeconomic concepts and data on real people. Economic fluctuations are irregular and unpredictable. Government can play a role in stabilizing the economy. Yeah, I mean, there's shocks to the market. We're in the midst of one right now. So think of like the pandemic, sort of unpredictable, sort of black swan event, so to speak, right? And there's a lot of other sorts of things that can lead to sort of unpredictable shocks on the market. There's a lot of different schools of thought about what the government ought to do. There's the classical school of thought, which is like government should kind of stay out and let the economy come back to its natural equilibrium. And then there's the sort of more modern Keynesian influenced school of thought, which says the government can stabilize the economy, whether that's through fiscal policy, which would sort of go in the realm of Keynes, or whether it's through monetary policy. So thinking about the actions of the central bank. Right now in the United States, we're getting incredibly accommodative monetary policy as the Fed is hoping to counterbalance the downturn in economic activity, and central banks around the world kind of doing similar things. Trade's not a zero-sum game. Overall gains exceed the overall losses. Yeah, that's true for international trade. That's true for trade between individuals, assuming that this is mutually beneficial, voluntary, non-coercive trade, right? If you have coercion, all of a sudden you get something that looks a lot more zero-sum, right? But if you don't have coercion, if trades are voluntary, we're expecting they're mutually beneficial and both parties are going to be made better off. It's a separate question about if one is made more better off than the other, and this has to do with issues around bargaining power, which pertains to each's alternative opportunities, but that's kind of a separate question. overall, we expect, trade is going to lead to a situation where the gains are going to exceed losses. Definitely with free trade. And that's one of the problems with protectionism, with free trade, there's winners and losers. We say the winners win more than the losers lose. With protectionism, we say there's winners and losers, but the winners win less than the losers lose. Such as when there's tariffs, that benefits the domestic productive interests that are protected by the tariffs at the expense of domestic consumers and at the expense of foreign producers, but at the benefit of foreign consumers. I've got a video on international trade. This is like the microeconomic foundations of international trade. I think if you go to my search thing and look under the effects of a tariff, not two-part tariff, that's something entirely different, but if you look at the effects of a tariff, I'll walk through those ideas. So then we'll think about the concepts of inferior, normal, and luxury good. So I talked about income elasticity. If there's an increase in income and the demand for the good increases, we expect a positive income elasticity and we expect the good to be a normal good. If there's an increase in income but the demand for the good falls, then we'd expect the good is going to be an inferior good. We'd expect the income elasticity of demand to be negative. For a luxury good, this is like a highly elastic normal good. So this is a situation where income rises and then the quantity demanded increases by a larger proportion. So the income elasticity for a luxury good is typically greater than 1. All right, substitution effect. Oh, this is interesting. So when there's a change in the price of a good, there's a couple things that happens. One is now that good is relatively cheaper or relatively more expensive compared to other alternatives that I could be buying. That's a substitution effect. So if the price of Pepsi rises, now Coke becomes relatively cheaper, so now I buy more Coke than Pepsi if I view them as substitutes. That's literally the substitution effect. There's another effect that's not mentioned here. It's the income effect, and that is if I continue to buy the now relatively more expensive good, my budget shrank, or the amount of disposable income that I have available has shrank. So my budget set is smaller if the price rises, especially if I keep buying whatever is that good. That's the income effect. Now I'm relatively poorer, right? So suppose I buy a lot of coffee, and I do, and the price of coffee rises. I'm going to keep buying coffee. My demand for coffee is pretty inelastic. It's not really going to matter what the price is to a point. Now if I keep buying the same amount of coffee, I have less money to spend on other things. That's the income effect. So I buy less of the other goods. The substitution effect is having to do with the price changes of goods relative to other goods you might be consuming. And that's my comment right here. Sunk cost fallacy. So sunk costs are unrecoverable costs. You should let bygones be bygones, right? Sunk cost fallacy ultimately amounts to taking sunk cost into consideration. So this would be when I was in grad school at the University of Arizona, I went to watch University of North Carolina, UNC, who had Tyler Hansborough playing against the Wildcats. We had Chase Budinger, and then there's kind of the key stars on the team at that time. And I got up at 2 a.m. to stand in line, waiting to get into McHale to watch this game. Game doors opened at something like 9 or something. And so I spent several hours in line. Then after like the first 10 minutes, the game was out of hand. There's no way Arizona was going to win. For sure we were going to lose. By halftime, it was just a complete blowout, and it was not fun. And so I decided to leave. I just decided to leave and go home. And the reason why is because I judged staying there to confer less benefit on me than if I were to leave. It was a marginal reasoning. I compared the benefit of going versus the benefit of staying. Now, the sunk cost fallacy would have been if I would have allowed the fact that I got up at 2 a.m. and spent all that time in line as relevant for my decision of whether or not to stay, right? No, it shouldn't make any difference other than now I'm tired. You shouldn't say, oh, I stayed in line for... Well, how many hours have there been? Like 7 hours. Therefore, I should see the game to its end. That's not a good reason to stay. There's a lot of good reasons to stay, see the game through the end. Some people argue about being like true fans if you leave early, so on and so forth. Those might be good reasons to stay. But whether or not you've waited in line for a long time before you got in shouldn't have any bearing on whether or not to continue going. My other example is if you purchase an all-you-can-eat buffet for $25, discover the food is terrible, should you try to eat your money's worth? No, absolutely not. You can only make your life worse by continuing to eat whatever is this terrible food. Diminishing marginal utility refers to the fact that the benefits shrink as consumption levels increase. So the marginal benefit from the first drink of water when you're really thirsty is greater than the marginal benefit from the second and the third and so on and so forth. At a certain point, if you drink too much water, it actually dilutes the electrolytes in your system and you die. So you don't want to drink too much water. That's definitely a case of diminishing marginal utility. There's a point by which your increased consumption of water turns to diminishing marginal utility to actually negative. It actually decreases your health. Natural rate of unemployment. So natural rate of unemployment refers to full employment. That's a situation where it's characterized by the lack of cyclical unemployment. Right now, due to the pandemic, most economies are in a recession or approaching recession. I guess we need maybe a couple quarters before it's formally described as a recession. But anyway, so we have rising unemployment. This is cyclical unemployment. This is due to like a reduction in business in economic activity. It's sort of the trough portion of the business cycle. So cyclical unemployment has to do with the fluctuations of the economy. Structural unemployment has to do with the mismatch of workers with the jobs available in that region. And frictional unemployment has to do with the mismatch between like your own employment and then the job. It's sort of like if you immediately graduate from college and haven't got a job yet, that's frictional unemployment. If you get fired, that's frictional unemployment. We'd expect frictional unemployment to be pretty temporary. You've got to just find another job in the region around you. Structural unemployment is typically going to be solved by either a new factory coming in or new employer coming in, or workers moving, or workers retooling and getting different human capital. What are the implications when actual GDP is lower or higher than potential GDP? Lower real GDP corresponds to a recessionary or a contractionary gap. So this is caused by either a leftward shift of the aggregate demand curve. You'd know that happened if there's deflation, or a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. You'd know that was true if there's inflation. So low GDP, high unemployment, and inflation is like stagflation. So it happened in the U.S. in the period of the 1970s. The standard recession is a leftward shift of aggregate demand. So there's deflation, which is actually worse than inflation at kind of moderate levels. If you have actual GDP higher than potential GDP, now you've got an inflationary or an expansionary gap. This would be caused by a rightward shift of aggregate demand if we have prices rising. So if you have an increase in output, decrease in unemployment, rise in inflation, now you've got demand increasing. If you have aggregate supply increasing, such as a decrease in the cost of doing business, now you've got a decrease in the price level, but an increase in output. So of the two, policymakers would be a lot more concerned about inflation than they would deflation if you have the expansionary gap, and they'd be probably more concerned about unemployment and output if you have a recessionary gap, although there's some debate about that. All right, what are the implications of, let's see if I'm at the end. I am. What's the implications of an unemployment rate that's higher or lower than the natural rate of unemployment? High unemployment, higher than the natural rate of unemployment, indicates that there's a recession. Lower unemployment indicates that there's been an economic expansion. Neither are necessarily great. The worst one, of course, is if there's high unemployment. Now you've got a recession. So remember, the natural rate of unemployment is characterized by a situation where there's cyclical unemployment. Now, that's actually relatively good news for businesses in a weird sense. If there's unemployment, we're expecting there's unemployment of humans as well as machines. And as a result, it should be relatively cheap for businesses to expand or to hire workers and hire labor, because they're going to be willing to accept relatively low wages, and the cost of additional capital is going to be relatively low. You're going to get things at a discount. And that's going to be good for business expansion, which is part of the natural then economic expansion. On the other hand, if there's low unemployment, that's not so good for businesses in a weird way, which is that it's going to be really expensive to be able to hire additional workers or to be able to recruit productive resources. And this is what kind of leads to rising prices. They have to kind of compete up wages and other prices in the economy. Interestingly, we didn't quite see this in the U.S. economy through the last expansion. This is kind of like one of the last indicators that hadn't really fallen into place. We saw coming out of the Great Recession, coming out of the Obama administration, we see unemployment falling, we see economic economic activity rising. And even through, after the election, President Trump, we see increase, we see an expansion of economic activity. Didn't quite see wages and inflation rising at the level that might have been what a lot of economists were looking for. For some insight into what's going on there, you can think of the relative shape of the aggregate supply curve. So lots of times we model aggregate supply as just being the sort of like upward sloping straight line, but suppose it looks a little L-shaped. Then you can get shifts along the aggregate supply curve where you'd get non-proportional changes in output and inflation. And this pertains to like the Keynesian and the classical sections of the aggregate supply curve. And in my aggregate demand, aggregate supply video goes into a little bit greater depth on there than I'm able to in this video here. All right, so from now on, we're going to pick up at the very beginning of this list, and I'm going to shift back, and these are the videos that I filmed and have rescued from my now hopefully charged laptop. So,
everyone. So in this video, I'm going to give kind of a walkthrough, an overview of some important terms for economics. I'm not going to be able to show myself. I got a new laptop, and I'm having a battle between Photo Booth, which I usually use to show the live feed of myself or the video feed of myself, and then QuickTime, which I use to record the screen, and it's just not working. And so I could have either just myself, or I could have the words. I think it's probably words and audio. I think this is probably the optimal setup given the constraints I'm facing. So anyways, so I'll talk about a collection of important ideas. I've got the term or the concept in regular text, and then in italics is kind of like my comments. First one is thinking about highest valued use. So the basic idea here is I want to remember that goods and services, resources are valued by buyers, and buyers are going to differ in terms of their valuation. Some are going to value things more highly than others, and the efficient outcome is to direct resources to their highest valued use. Failing to do so leads to inefficiency. So the basic idea is when this happens, entrepreneurs or business can come up with ways to rectify that inefficiency by directing those resources to higher valued use. Kind of an example of something that could exist that doesn't is expanding the sharing economy. So we have like Uber that sort of brings your car out of your garage and into the use of those who need rides at the moment. Something similar with Airbnb. You can think of this like wholesale in terms of like, we've got a lot of garage equipment like shovels. We've got a lawnmower, things that aren't being used, at least not a lot, even during the appropriate season, and could very well be rented out to those who would value those goods more highly than I do in the present use just sitting in the garage. Right? So the idea is like you could think of a way to be able to direct resources that are currently idle or currently in lower valued uses to higher valued uses, assuming there's a way to do this with relatively low transaction costs. And actually that's been kind of the goals of modern entrepreneurship. A lot of the app-based entrepreneurship is lowering transaction costs for bringing resources into higher valued uses. Like we see that with Uber and Airbnb, as I mentioned. Next important concept is thinking about the market system versus the command system. Basically ways of organizing the economy as a whole, and the really important idea has to do with information. Basic idea is the market system uses prices. It uses the price signal to capture the information coming from the valuations of buyers and the cost to sellers to determine how much of a good should be produced or service and to whom it should be supplied. Basic idea is that you can take the decentralized actions of a lot of decision makers, collate this information and direct this through the price signal in a way that people can coordinate on. It's kind of like in an orchestra, it's kind of like the conductor that all the different sections and instruments are looking at. The command system is where like the government or a centralized decision maker would make all the decisions, and there's a lot of inefficiency there because they cannot hope to have all the relevant information. And so there's going to be all kinds of problems where the central planner or in a command economy is going to say who is producing or who gets what. And the problem is, overall, this leads to a situation where resources are not put to their highest valued use because that information is not available to the central planner. The idea around the market economy is coming from some insights from Adam Smith. In particular, the key idea is the invisible hand, which is the idea that the price mechanism is going to guide behavior of decentralized actors towards what would be the optimal economic outcome from the standpoint of efficiency. This typically involves specialization according to comparative advantage, and to the division of labor, which makes this possible. So if we break down tasks into constituent parts, that's kind of the division of labor. The basic idea is take like a project and separate it out into component roles, such that individuals that are really good at those individual parts will specialize, and then those who are less good at the other things will specialize in something else, and so on and so forth. This leads to a situation where we can get more stuff overall. Now, the key insight from Adam Smith, though, wasn't just the division of labor, wasn't just specialization, because this is sort of something that people were well aware of even back in 1776, which was the year in which Wealth of Nations was published. Everyone already knew that this works within economic units, such as like households or villages. The key insight with prices and with Adam Smith is that this allows for the facilitation of the division of labor and then specialization across economic units, and so across widely dispersed economic units, which is really important. So across like countries, across regions, city-states, so on and so forth. All right. Opportunity cost is a really important principle in economics. It pertains to sacrifice. It's like what is given up or what is foregone when you do one thing instead of another. The opportunity cost of a resource is essentially its next highest alternative use. So the idea is there's many different things resources can be put towards. There's several alternatives, and whichever one you select, there's some benefits associated with this, but there's important costs, such as the foregone ability to pursue those other uses of whatever is that resource. In terms of optimal decision making, of course, it involves like being aware of opportunity cost, kind of ignore opportunity cost at your own peril. It also involves paying attention to marginal analysis, which is the idea of comparing the additional benefit to the additional cost of doing one more of an activity. So it's an incremental comparison. So if the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost, you do more. If the marginal benefit is less than the marginal cost, you do less. If the marginal benefit is equal to the marginal cost, well, then you're presently optimizing. So thinking specifically with profit maximization, a profit maximizing firm that's setting a single price or having a price in the market is going to want to produce such that they're bringing their marginal cost equal to their marginal revenue. For a perfectly competitive market, this involves bringing marginal cost equal to market price. In a monopoly case, we're going to end up with a price that is going to be somewhat higher than the marginal revenue, but the marginal revenue will still be equal to the marginal cost, even in the monopoly case. And the same thing will be true, such as for the oligopoly case. We'll have a situation where the oligopoly is also going to be producing where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So I've got overarching economics concepts here. I'm actually I wrote up something a little bit later on that I'll come back to that, and it's kind of talking about the overarching economic concepts here: marginal reasoning, opportunity cost. Don't consider sunk costs for marginal reasoning, and so on and so forth. Next kind of big idea is supply and demand analysis. You want to think about the difference between demand and quantity demanded, the difference between supply and quantity supplied. You want to understand why the curves are shifting, what caused the curve to shift, why the curves are either upward or downward sloping, and so on and so forth. Well, big idea is demand refers to the entire relationship between prices and quantities demanded. And so in order to get a change in demand, we need something other than price to change. Now, if price changes, you're just moving up or down the same demand curve. So that's a change in quantity demanded. And the same thing for supply. If there's a change in something other than price, you can get a change in supply. If price changes, you can only get a change in quantity supplied, if we're talking about the supply relationship. Thinking about like why the demand curve's downward sloping, wow, that's just the law of demand. At higher prices, there's a lower quantity demanded. At lower prices, there's a higher quantity demanded. And then with supply, as prices rise, well, sellers are going to be willing to bring a larger quantity to the market. At lower prices, sellers are going to be willing to bring a much lower quantity to the market. So that explains why the supply curve is generally upward sloping. Then my comment on here is thinking about one cause for one effect. And this is really important as you're thinking about the comparative statics analysis. If you're thinking about a situation where either something changes that affects demand or supply, we want to only have one curve moving at a time. So if there's like a change in consumer tastes, this will lead to a change in demand. you should not assume a change in supply as a result. No, because relative to supply, here's what's happened. The change in consumer taste, maybe consumers view the good more favorably. This leads to an increase in demand relative to the supply curve, to a static supply curve. This is giving us an increase in price and a higher quantity supplied, right? If there's a change in demand relative to supply, it is a change in price causing a change in quantity supplied. Suppose there's something that increases the cost of inputs, right? This is going to end up being a reduction in supply. Assuming demand doesn't change, relative to demand, this is going to give us a lower price and a change in quantity demanded. And so, importantly, for each shock, for each factor, for each determinant of demand or supply, you want to expect only one curve is actually changing, meaning there's only a shift affecting one curve, and then the change that might befall the other curve would simply be a change in price that's going to then actualize a change in quantity. All right, so then I'll think about price elasticity of demand. I want to think about what variables make elasticity more elastic, or make the demand more elastic, which make it more inelastic. I want to know how to use the midpoint equation and the percentage equation. We want to understand the inferences one can make based on elasticity to increase total revenue and or profits. By the law of demand, we know at higher prices there's a lower quantity demanded. What elasticity adds is responsiveness. So how much is the change? The midpoint formula is just taking like the average change in quantity divided by the average change in price, because the percentage formula, the definition of price elasticity of demand, is just the percentage change in quantity divided by the percentage change in price. The midpoint formula just proxies for this. It gives us the average change. So it's like Q2 minus Q1 divided by average quantity, P2 minus P1 divided by the average price. That's just the midpoint formula. So in terms of increasing total revenue or increasing profits, well, we think of increases in price leading to an increase in revenue when demand is inelastic, increases in price leading to a decrease in revenue when demand is elastic. And the important idea is that if demand is inelastic, that increase in price is going to be proportionally larger than the decrease in quantity demanded. And so the overwhelming effect on revenue, which is just price times quantity, would be the increase in price. However, if demand is really responsive, then as price increases even by just a little bit, the quantity is going to fall by a lot. And so that decrease in quantity is going to draw down revenue rather than increase it as price rises. So that's why, linking up to revenue, it's important to know if the demand is inelastic or elastic in terms of like how revenue changes. Now, ultimately, the firm's interested in maximizing profits, not maximizing revenue. And so we're not just interested in like raising or increasing revenue, because we also care about the cost side. And this gives rise to our optimal equation for our firm with market power. We want to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, and the elasticity version of this is our markup rule. So it's taking the percentage markup, which is price minus marginal cost divided by price, makes it a percentage markup, right? The markup is just price minus marginal cost. And then this is equal to 1 over the price elasticity of demand, which basically tells us that the more inelastic is the demand. Think about like smaller and smaller e's in the absolute value, right? Smaller and smaller values. Think of something that's going like closer and closer, like think of dividing 1 divided by 1/2, that's 2. 1 divided by 1/3, it's 3. 1 divided by 1/10 is 10, right? As the elasticity gets smaller and smaller, gets closer to 0, 1 over the elasticity is a larger amount, telling us that as demand is more inelastic, then markup is larger. For shutdown analysis, what's relevant are comparing, firstly, price to average variable cost, right? If price is below average variable cost, you want to shut down. Price is above average variable cost, you'll continue producing. If price is above average variable cost but below the break-even point, which is the minimum of average total cost, then you would actually still exit in the long run, right? Shutdown is a short-run decision, exit is a long-run decision. Ultimately, what's relevant are the avoidable costs, right? The idea is, can the firm save money by shutting down? In other words, can it avoid some costs? And if the answer is yes, then maybe it will. If you ultimately want to ignore the unavoidable costs, because there's no point in changing your decision if it's not affecting the costs that are borne. And so the idea is like unavoidable costs, those are irrelevant for shutdown. They're considered sunk in the short run, such as like rent payments or something like that within the month. Break-even decision, the break-even point is where price is equal to marginal cost at the minimum of average total cost. It's the point where there's zero economic profit. If price is higher, then there's economic profit. If price is lower, then there's a loss. And if price is below average variable cost, well, then you'll want to actually shut down. In terms of the components of costs, well, there's fixed costs and variable costs comprise total costs. Fixed costs are those that are invariant to changes in output. So these are things where it's not going to matter if you produce 1 unit or 1,000 units. Fixed costs are the same, such as like rent or the expenditure on capital, like machines. If at least one cost is fixed, then we're in the short run. If all costs are variable, then we're in the long run. Variable costs are those that change with output. This is like the cost of ingredients. If you have a cookie factory, the factory space and the machinery that goes into producing cookies and packaging in them, those are your fixed costs. The ingredients, those would pertain to variable costs, and same with labor as well. Thinking about the implications of our 4 different market structures, well, we have perfect competition, we have monopoly, we have oligopoly, we have monopolistic competition. And basically, the kind of key differentiating factors like barriers to entry. With perfect competition, we have many buyers, many sellers, products are identical, there's full information, there's no barriers to entry, and there's identical products. In monopoly, there's like extreme barriers to entry, and monopolists are able to extract profits on the basis of the fact that they don't have to worry about competitors at that present time. With monopolistic competition, we have product differentiation, but we have a lot of competitors. So we have like market power within a specific niche. So you think of like if you have like a food truck or you have a restaurant, you've got some degree of market power within the particular niche that you're working with. However, thinking about the market as a whole, it's going to look much more competitive. With oligopoly, we're thinking of a few strong firms. We're thinking about the strategic interdependence between those firms' decisions, especially realizing that they're going to have to pay attention to their rival's response as well as to customers' response. How to determine if there's a Nash equilibrium, or how to determine what the Nash equilibrium is? Well, a strategy profiles a Nash equilibrium if no one has a profitable unilateral deviation. So it means that the outcome is an equilibrium if no one wants to be the only one to switch. Right? So things about the things that it doesn't mean everybody's optimizing, doesn't mean that we're in the best possible outcome, doesn't mean that we have winners or losers even. So understand, like, game theory sounds like we have winners and losers. No, that's not built into the structure of game theory. It's kind of like inappropriately named in some sense. Ultimately, it really just means that we're both currently, or that all the players are currently mutually best responding to each other. It means that anything else that they would do individually would end up being worse from that particular point. There might be other equilibria in the games or in the game, or other outcomes in the game that would have higher payoffs to one or both players. It just has to be that they cannot get there alone. They would need the other person to switch to. And as long as there is no profitable unilateral deviations, we have a Nash equilibrium at that point. Moral hazard. Moral hazard is a problem of asymmetric information coming after the transaction. So it's ultimately due to this incentive problem, basically where the individual decision maker acts in their own interest, but against the interest of the group or like some other important party. So the idea is like there's either opportunistic behavior, or failing to take adequate precautions, or simply acting in one's interest rather than in the interest of those others that are affected by their decision, such as like you might think of like the principal agent problem. I'll talk about a little bit later on. The principal would be, like management, and then the agent would be the individual workers, and workers might not work as hard as the manager would really hope that they would. Why? Well, maybe the workers aren't sufficiently incentivized. Maybe they're paid the same rate whether they work hard or not, and so then it's easy not to work hard. Loss aversion. Loss aversion is the idea that people treat losses far worse than the equivalent foregone gains. So framing is really important. People like to avoid losses, and that's kind of like a really important thing, especially given the fact that people can sometimes do silly things just based around the idea of trying to avoid losses. Myopia is another sort of behavioral economic idea. So it's a bias referring to people focusing specifically on the present, to the exclusion of other important factors, and then like sort of ignoring the future consequences. It's like present bias. And so that can be really big and big problem when it comes to like saving and thinking about the future. Adverse selection, well, this is the problem of asymmetric information that arises prior to the transaction. So it's like literally bad selection. Ultimately, this is where, for instance, those with the undesirable trait would be more likely to be selected than those with the desirable trait from the standpoint of like the firm. So for instance, if you're selling flood insurance, there's adverse selection because the undesirable customers, those living in a floodplain, are far more interested in signing up for flood insurance than those living high up on a hill, right? Okay, and adverse selection. It's a problem of asymmetric information that happens prior to the transaction and actually can keep the transaction from happening in the first place if market participants are sufficiently worried about the adverse selection problem. Now, as a matter of fact, worries about moral hazard can keep the transaction from happening, but what separates adverse selection from moral hazard is specifically it happens prior to the transaction, and it refers to like bad selection. So it's if there's overrepresentation of those with a bad trait, such as if you're trying to sell flood insurance. If you're trying to sell flood insurance and if those living on hills are not as evenly represented in the pool of applicants for insurance as those living in the valley, right? And so if those living in the floodplain are more interested in flood insurance than those living at a hill, you're probably going to have the adverse selection problem. All right, price discrimination. Price discrimination, it requires market power, it requires the ability to block resale, and call this arbitrage, and it requires at least some information about the willingness to pay of customers. So not all resale would be arbitrage, but the type of resale that would be profitable to exploit inefficiencies in terms of like allocative inefficiency, where the product goes to the wrong person and then somebody decides to rectify this situation by finding the person that actually values it most highly and selling it to them at a premium. That's the arbitrage problem. Example of arbitrage would be if there's different prices in two different markets and you just buy low in one market and sell high in the other market. So obviously we don't want that to happen with third degree price discrimination, for instance, and actually the other types of price discrimination as well. Direct price discrimination involves offering prices to targeted specific individuals. So this would be like first degree price discrimination, where everybody gets their own price, or third degree price discrimination, where we have our demanders separated into groups by some identifiable characteristic that's correlated with their willingness to pay or their elasticity, such as whether they're a visitor or a local, or a student or a non-student, or children or adult, or something like that. Indirect price discrimination involves some element of self-selection. So it'd be like second degree price discrimination or some type of hurdle. So an example of second degree price discrimination, if you go to zoom.us, so think of like Zoom for video conferencing, they offer several different plans and you can opt into whichever of the 4 versions you'd like. I think there's like 3 where you actually pay, and then there's the free version for like 40-minute meetings. And basically the idea is that at these different prices, people are going to self-select into whichever package is optimal for them. Hurdles would be, suppose you have some obstruction to receiving a discount, such as clipping coupons, some nuisance, something that's bothersome that makes people have to go out of their way to receive the discount, such as like a coupon where those with high willingness to pay are just going to pay full price. Those with low willingness to pay are going to jump over the hurdle. They're going to be willing to clip the coupon and incur that extra cost. Another example would be in a situation where you have like a day-old bakery. So you can get a discount if you're willing to wait to the next morning to buy whatever donut or pastry or whatever. Those who are not willing to wait the next day pay full price on the day of. Porter's 5 forces refers to an interesting application of economics by Harvard economist Michael Porter. So the 5 forces are existing rivalry, market power of buyers, market power of sellers, threat of substitutes, and threat of entry. And the basic idea is you want to use this to assess the profitability of the industry. Existing rivalry refers to the competitive balance of the market already. So think of like the airline industry, the existing rivalries between firms like Delta, Southwest, American, so on and so forth. Market power of buyers, some of the big determinants are your individual buyers strong relative to the firm, or are they small? So if you have a website and you're selling to directly to consumers, your market power of buyers is probably pretty low because you're selling to individual buyers who are buying a small quantity. However, if you're selling to a large buyer, like a large purchaser, then market power of buyers might be substantially higher. So for instance, like if UPS is selling delivery services to individuals, buyers have very small market power. But if they're selling delivery services via contracts to another business, like fatbraintoys.com or something like this, that's going to have a large volume, now all of a sudden there's going to be quite a bit more market power of buyers. Market power of sellers. Well, let's take the FatBrain example. So the seller is basically the input seller. So who are you getting your inputs from? So if you are beholden, if you're buying a large quantity, if you have like only a few sellers to buy from, such as like UPS or FedEx, in the FatBrain Toys example, you're going to have to have somebody providing delivery for these toys that you're selling, and so there's very few providers of package delivery. UPS, there's the U.S. Postal Service for parcel delivery anyway. There's FedEx, but beyond those three, or maybe a couple regional ones, you don't have a whole lot of options. Threat of substitutes. So this is typically like outside the industry. So are we worried about people doing something entirely different, such as I gave the airline industry example. Threat of substitute. Oh, my screen went dark. Sorry, hopefully you didn't see that. Threat of substitutes for the airline industry would be like Zoom, right? Video conferencing. Threat of entry would be, are we worried about additional firms coming into this market to capture some of the prospective profits? So this would be like the electric vehicle market. You have Tesla, and then you have a threat of entry from existing legacy car producers, but you also have a threat of entry from now a whole collection of rival startups. The idea of moats, think of Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett's looking for economic castles protected by unbreachable moats. Unbreathable. I was thinking about COVID. Unbreachable moats. Basically, the idea is whether or not there's something that can protect against entry. Do you have a competitive advantage that's going to be protected for a long time? So this would be like if you have a situation where you have maybe you have control of an important input. So think of like Aluminum Company of America, Alcoa, which controlled the vast majority of, like, I think it's like the bauxite mines or something like this. So if you have some key input, or if you have some key technological advantage, that'd be really difficult to duplicate. Or think of like SpaceX with contracts with NASA. They've got a huge first mover advantage. They've established this history. Yeah, you could conceive of somebody generating a new space vehicle provider, but it'd be really difficult now that SpaceX and has already entered the market. Same thing with like providing military-grade aircraft to the Department of Defense. It's pretty much like Lockheed Martin, and I guess there's maybe like one other. I don't want to reveal my ignorance of aircraft, military-grade aircraft providers. I mean, I know it's like Boeing and so on and so forth. All right, so transfer pricing. So transfer pricing refers to pricing policies between subsidiaries of a larger entity. The basic idea with transfer pricing is you've got some inputs that you're providing, and then you have to make a determination of at what price to sell them at the different subsidiaries. And the reason why there's kind of an issue is because, well, this can be used for tax avoidance. I mean, of course, regulators are going to pay heightened attention to stuff like this. But you could think of like one situation where it'd be really relevant is, suppose you have a firm that's producing ink cartridges and then printers and then ink, right? Well, if you're selling ink cartridges, you could either buy ink from your ink division, or you could outsource and buy ink from somebody else. And you can think about the different pricing between the organization. Principal agent problem. The key insight from the principal agent problem is moral hazard, right? And then how to rectify it. The idea is you've got some principal, and then you've got some agent that's acting on behalf of the principal. And the problem is their incentives might be completely different, right? So you could think of elected officials as the agent. You could think of voters as the principal, right? So voters hire the agent, hire the elected official to act on their behalf, but the elected official might act on their own interests, right? There might be an incentive incompatibility problem. Or you could think of like a realtor who's, you hire to sell your house, and then the homeowner as the principal. Well, the homeowner has different incentives than the realtor themselves. The realtor might either shirk, not work sufficiently hard, or might try to sell other houses instead. I mean, the basic idea is like the realtor is going to get something like 3 to 6% of the sale price, and the homeowner gets the rest. So the homeowner has a much greater incentive for a timely sale, I suppose, than does the realtor. There's an interesting paper by Stephen Levitt, forgone, thinking about pricing of realtor services. Right, so like I say here, the problem is the principal's incentives tend to misalign with the agents unless much thought is given to the incentive structure to try to align the principal and the agent's incentives together. The biggest factor for a nation's output, or for nation's biggest factor for a nation's prosperity, is its output. We measure like the value of the economic value created through GDP. Right? Output's typically measured by real GDP. This gives the productive value created by the economy in a given time period. Right? Real GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within the domestic economy given or within a specific time period, typically 1 year. We want real GDP because it's going to be corrected. It's going to be inflation adjusted. So it's going to be real variables are inflation adjusted variables. Those are going to be actual outputs rather than nominal GDP. Think of how GDP is calculated. It's the market value. So it's going to be price times the quantity. So those prices can be influenced by inflation, of course. So real gross domestic product, real GDP, is going to be C plus I plus G plus EX, right? C is consumption, I is investment, G is government spending, EX is net exports. So real GDP is the sum of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Consumption is the largest component, and the largest component of consumption is services. Right, largest share of consumption is services. Consumption's typically by households, investment typically by business, government spending, strictly by the government, and then net exports, that's just literally exports minus imports. For the U.S. economy, it's negative. U.S. exports somewhere around $1.5 trillion worth, and imports somewhere around $2.5 trillion worth. Although that was approximately correct prior to the pandemic. I haven't seen the revised numbers. All right, so then implications of differentials in per capita GDP or income. Per capita GDP is literally just what's real GDP divided by the population, right? This is like a really rough measure of the standard of living. Higher GDP per capita associates with a higher standard of living, though there's definitely the possibility for some error since this assumes that everyone's equal. So for instance, like Qatar and Bahrain have really high GDP, real GDP per capita. These are like kind of economies that are based around like oil or something like this. There's other really high real GDP per capita countries like Monaco and Luxembourg and Norway. What's happening in a lot of these cases is there's actually like tremendous inequality, and the idea that except for the Scandinavian countries, I suppose, but the idea that with real GDP per capita is that the wealth is evenly distributed, but we know that's definitely not the case, and there might be more or less inequality in some places or others. But that's why we say it's sort of like a rough measure of standard of living. Right, so what's going on with these differentials? Well, they're typically reflecting differences in productivity, right? Standard of living is driven by the productivity of workers, which interacts with the productivity of their capital. The biggest input into worker productivity is human capital, and then the human capital is defined as like educational attainment and then experience, and then you need high-skilled workers with high-skilled, with machines to be able to have the highest productivity. Supply, demand, and resource allocation, determinants of real GDP. Well, the determinants of real GDP are things like consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. The determinants of aggregate demand are therefore the same things. Determinants of aggregate supply, well, I mean, there's a whole list of determinants of aggregate supply. It's easy enough. Like you can just type into Google determinants like of aggregate supply, or what are the shifters of aggregate supply. As you're looking at the list, you'll basically see these things reflect the cost of doing business. So when I'm solving one of these problems, like I'm thinking about if aggregate demand or aggregate supply is going to shift, I'd look to see, is this something that's going to affect one of the factors, one of the determinants of real GDP? If so, it's probably going to affect the aggregate demand curve. Is this something that's primarily going to affect the cost of doing business? If so, then it's probably going to affect the aggregate supply curve. Such as like a rise in oil prices. If there's a rise in oil prices, oil is such a really important input into the production of so many things, and then the distribution of goods and services. So we'd expect this will create a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. All right, unemployment rate and its implications. Well, the unemployment rate is literally just the fraction of those unemployed out of the labor force, right? So labor force is going to be, at least in the US, is going to be those non-institutionalized adults counted as being age 16 or older, civilian, who have looked, well, so that's the labor force. And then those who are unemployed are those from that group who have looked for a job and been unsuccessful within the last 30 days. Unemployment rate, therefore, can fall one of two ways. Either the fraction of those looking for jobs unsuccessfully can fall, or the labor force can fall, right? So let's see. The implications, well, the other thing that I like to remind you when you're thinking about unemployment rate, this is typically going to be associated with lower, when there's high unemployment, there's going to be lower output. So when GDP falls, you're going to get unemployment rising. When GDP rises, you're going to get unemployment falling. That's actually a more sort of ironclad relationship than the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve we'll talk about in a second. That's the inverse relationship between inflation and output, right? So this is the idea that when GDP rises, inflation, the Phillips curve is the inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. So when GDP rises, inflation rises, unemployment falls, right? And then when GDP falls, then unemployment rises and inflation falls. So the Phillips relationship depends on a leftward and rightward shift of the aggregate demand curve, but if the aggregate supply curve shifts, you can draw this on a piece of paper, you'll see if you get a leftward shift of aggregate supply, you get stagflation, you get inflation rising, and you get unemployment rising. The important thing is you want to think of unemployment as involving both humans and capital. So humans and machines, think of all productive resources being unemployed when there's a recession, and then as there's an economic expansion, you think of more and more productive resources are already employed. All right, how to determine real income based on inflation and nominal income rates? Well, real income is reflecting purchasing power. It's reflecting how much goods and services one's income can actually attract. So it's like real income is like what's the purchasing power in terms of like real output of like actual physical goods. And I don't have that calculation here. I might have to. I guess this is my draft version. So I have to go back and see if I can put that in the description or something like that. Actually, I hate to do this during a video. I'm just going to take a screenshot of this so I remember to do that. That's really loud. It's really annoying for me and for you, so sorry about that. All right. So supply and demand shocks and effects on business cycles. Well, things that affect demand will shift the aggregate demand curve, right? So rightward shifts lead to an expansion of GDP, falling unemployment, like I said before, rising price level, other things equal, so inflation. The reverse for leftward shifts, right? Rightward shifts of aggregate supply are due to like reduced cost of doing business, leads to increased output, lower unemployment, and lower price level, and then the reverse for leftward shifts. When we're getting these shocks to the market and you're getting aggregate demand and aggregate supply shifting, we're expecting some things are sticky. For instance, prices are sticky. And so we're going to think of like what inputs are flexible and not flexible based on different time horizons. Well, in the short run, we're expecting the prices are going to be really sticky, downward sticky, so difficult to lower prices, right? Especially wages. And wages are going to take kind of a long time to go, typically take a long time to go down. That's why deflation is such a problem for firms, because if the price level is falling, then firms are paying their workers with money that's worth more than essentially the outputs that they're producing. Rents also tend to be sticky over the duration of the lease, right? In the short run, rent is going to be a fixed cost. You're not going to be able to change that. In the long run, you're going to be able to get out of rent and get into more favorable leases and so on and so forth. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply model. Explain why the aggregate demand curve shifts downward. Well, the aggregate demand, this is missing too. Oh, sorry, this is probably, oddly enough, more frustrating for me than for you. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply model, well, you draw this like an X, right? The downward sloping one is just aggregate demand, upward sloping one is aggregate supply. And then we actually, through the equilibrium, we actually draw one more thing. So the equilibrium is going to involve our, so this is like aggregate demand, this is like aggregate supply, and then through the equilibrium is going to be long run aggregate supply. And so this will be, I don't know if I could type this in. So this will be long run aggregate supply. This one is technically short run aggregate supply, right? This vertical, sorry, not the vertical, this is short run aggregate supply, although sometimes we just call it like plain old aggregate supply. And then the downward one is aggregate demand, right? And then I need to draw in the axes. So the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model. I've got a video on this. Is way better than this. You could just go to, into my search feature and then find the aggregate demand, aggregate supply model explained. It's gonna be a way better video than this. So this is real GDP, some measure of output, and then the vertical is going to be some price level. And the way that this relates to our standard, this is price level, the way that this relates to our standard supply and demand model is that the standard supply and demand model, where you just have like regular ordinary supply, ordinary demand, that is for a single market, single good or single service. The aggregate demand, aggregate supply model is for the entire economy. That's why we have to have real GDP, and then we have to have as the price level. So the changes in the price level give us inflation if the price level rises, deflation if it falls, and then at the equilibrium we have the full employment level of GDP, right? That's the idea, or that's like potential GDP. If the current or actual GDP is beyond the potential or full employment GDP, there's an expansionary or inflationary gap. If it's smaller than the full or potential GDP, then we have a recessionary or contractionary gap. All right, let's see if I can put this away so I can scroll again. Relationship between interest rate and investment. Well, we expect there's more investment at lower interest rates. We get a rightward shift to the aggregate demand curve and less investment at higher interest rates, so a leftward shift of the aggregate supply curve. That's because you have to compare the interest rate to the rate of return on investment. And the less investment, higher interest rate, leftward shift to the aggregate supply. I still want this to be aggregate demand curve. Aggregate demand. Well, I was just reading this. I should have been thinking. All right, here I've got my wrong thing here. I want this to be, I mean, it could be a leftward shift to aggregate supply curve, at least in the long run, right? But I mean, for this to be aggregate demand curve, because what's going to happen is there's less investment. That's going to be a smaller, so investment's a component of GDP, so it's going to be a leftward shift of aggregate demand. In the long run, that's probably what I was thinking about when I wrote this. In the long run, you could get a leftward shift of aggregate supply if there's less investment over time, which means there's you're doing less to maintain and to build out new capacity and new factories, and then over time there's depreciation, meaning the existing productive stock deteriorates, and so you can produce less and less over time if there's insufficient investment to rebuild the infrastructure. And so that's probably what I was talking about here. Ultimately, you have to compare the interest rate to the rate of return on investment, right? You compare the interest rate to the rate of return on investment, because if the interest rate is higher than the rate of return on the investment, you don't make that investment. If the interest rate is lower than the rate of return on the investment, you do, because you come out ahead, because you're earning more interest than you're paying out. Phillips curve, think about the Phillips curve trade-off. It's the inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. It's a basic idea that as inflation rises, we're expecting unemployment to fall. If inflation's falling, we're expecting unemployment to be rising. But this requires the aggregate demand curve to be moving more than the aggregate supply curve. If the aggregate supply curve moves more, as during the period of stagflation, now all of a sudden you've got a situation where you don't have the Phillips curve relationship holding anymore. So here's like aggregate demand and aggregate supply. If aggregate supply shifts to the left, I'll just call this 2, I'll call this 1. This is like our price level. This is my GDP, so I'll put like real GDP. This is my output. I've never used this draw thing before. I was liking it until just then. Amazing. Well, I said it was GDP and it's like GDI or whatever. Cool, and now I lost that thing. So here I was going to talk about like how I never used this before. I thought it was awesome. No, now I'm super frustrated with it. So all right, whatever. So basic idea is that here we have price rising, right? And we have output. Could be kidding me, right? And you have output falling, right? So when output falls, we have unemployment rising, right? So that's the important thing. All right. So I'm going to put this away. That's nonsense. All right. I mean, no, this is not nonsense, just like me fooling around with this is nonsense. It's good content. Good content, Ben. All right. So monetary policy. Well, key tool of monetary policy is open market operations. This is when the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee, decides to choose how many treasury bonds to buy, right? And so this affects the federal funds rate, which is the overnight interest rate paid between banks, member banks at the Federal Reserve. So why does this matter? Well, why would you borrow if you're a bank? Why would you borrow from another bank? Well, basically to meet your reserve requirement. And so the idea is like every bank in the Federal Reserve District, as part of the Federal Reserve System, has an account with the Federal Reserve. And to meet the reserve requirement, they can do one of two things. They can keep vault cash, right? They have to hold back a fraction of every deposit. They can either keep it in the vault, which is like super inefficient, or they can keep it in their account with the Federal Reserve. But during this time, of course, they're making loans, and then they're getting loans paid back, and so there's quite a bit of fluctuation from time to time. And if whatever reason, they don't have enough funds to cover their reserve requirement, like they get in trouble, obviously. So they have to be able to come up with enough to have enough in the account to be able to meet their requirement. So that this might require borrowing from another bank. And the interest rate at which that happens, that's the federal funds rate. So this affects the incentives that banks are facing in terms of if they want to self-insure by holding additional excess reserves. There's also interest paid on excess reserves. The other things that are relevant for monetary policy are the discount rate, like getting loans directly from the Fed, although historically there's some stigma attached to that. It seems like it stands to reason that if you can't get why are you getting a loan directly from the Fed? Well, it's because you're not able to get a loan from another bank. Although, for instance, during the Great Recession, the Fed said that banks should be able to borrow directly from the discount window, that's at the discount rate, loans directly from the Fed, without anybody assuming anything negative about the integrity of those banks. The reserve requirement is the fraction of deposits that banks are required to hold, and that's another tool. I'll talk about this a little bit. So in terms of open market operations, the nice mnemonic device is buy bonds equals bigger bucks. So if the Fed buys bonds, the money supply increases, the interest rate falls, and investment rises. Or you could just remember what the Fed did during the Great Recession, which is buy a tremendous amount of actually exotic assets, but they increased the money supply, drove down interest rates to the zero bound, and we expect investment to rise. Then the opposite is selling bonds. So then we get smaller bucks. So if the Fed sells bonds, the money supply decreases, interest rate rises, investment falls. Oh, who are they buying and selling from? They're buying and selling from the member banks. So basically, in some sense, when the Fed buys bonds, they're buying them from banks with accounts with the Fed, and they're essentially adding zeros to the end of those banks' bank accounts. Or when they're selling bonds, who buys those? Well, those banks. And so then they're taking zeros off of their bank accounts, right? It's essentially, it's a little bit simplification, but kind of how it actually works. All right, fiscal policy. So thinking about the tools of fiscal policy, well, this is changes in government spending and then changes in taxes. So we'd expect an increase in government spending to directly affect the government component, the G component, and shift to aggregate demand rightward. Decrease in taxes indirectly affects consumption, possibly also investment, depending on what the taxes are on, leading to an aggregate demand shift rightward. And then if aggregate demand shifts rightward, we expect that this is going to boost GDP, lower unemployment, and then raise inflation. And then everything that I just said, you can undo that. You can just reverse everything, and everything just reverses. So a decrease in government spending, an increase in taxes will lead to a leftward shift of aggregate demand, which will lower inflation, lower output, raise unemployment. All right, so comparative and absolute advantage. Well, trade is based around comparative advantage. That's being able to produce at the lowest opportunity cost. Absolute advantage means being the most efficient producer, getting more stuff with fewer inputs. Comparative advantage, again, is producing at the lowest opportunity cost. So relevant for international trade, if the domestic price is below the world price, that country has a comparative advantage in that good and then ought to export. If the domestic price is above the world price, then the country lacks a comparative advantage and ought to import. Ultimately, there's winners and losers. We'd expect with free trade, the winners are going to win more than the losers lose. And so we'd expect, like, what's happening is trade is ultimately, overall, making both economies better off, although certainly there can be costs and losses. With free trade, with exporting, we'd expect the domestic producers win, the foreign consumers win, the foreign producers lose, and the domestic consumers lose. Why do the domestic consumers lose? Well, if the domestic firms are exporting, then goods that would have been bought domestically are now sold to buyers abroad. Basically, there's buyers abroad that are outbidding domestic consumers. And by virtue of buying imports, the foreign producers are undercut by the exporter. The opposite's true for imports. For imports, the domestic consumers win. They get goods at a lower price than they could get locally. Domestic producers lose. So they're being undercut by foreign producers. Foreign consumers lose, but foreign producers win. And whether you have an import or export situation, there's these four parties on both sides of the transaction. And then the big thing you want to think about is, are the gains or losses concentrated or dispersed? So with exports, the gains are very concentrated amongst the exporters and the producers. The losses are very dispersed in the domestic country, where the consumers each lose a little bit. In the importing country, the gains are widely dispersed amongst consumers who are now buying a little bit cheaper from everyone, and then the losses are highly concentrated from domestic factories that are now being outcompeted by foreign factories. In terms of, this gives rise to protectionism, because if the losses are highly concentrated and very obvious, now there's like a political motivation for counterbalancing these with protectionism. So think of the effects of tariffs, quotas, world price, domestic price, and consumers and producers, foreign consumers and producers. Well, tariffs are taxes on imports, and the idea is if you're going to buy an imported product, you're going to pay whatever was the original price plus a little bit more in terms of tax. And that little bit more is enough to raise the price at which the foreign good is going to trade, such that it's going to be easier for domestic producers to be able to compete. That's the idea. So tariffs raise the price of imported good, which undermines the ability of foreign producers to undercut domestic producers. Ultimately, it's a situation where the domestic country lacks a comparative advantage and ought to be an importer, but doesn't want to, or at least doesn't want to fully realize those gains. Why? Well, because of those losses to the domestic producers that I mentioned. Quotas are similar. They're basically quantity limits on imports. And ultimately what's happening, well, protectionism tends to benefit domestic producers. They have kind of a lot of bargaining power, and they're the ones that argue fervently for protectionism. Tends to harm domestic consumers, tends to harm foreign producers, and tends to benefit foreign consumers. It determins of exchange rates. So with exchange rates, I mean, the really big key is how currency demand and currency supply compare. So if there's greater demand for one currency, it'll appreciate. If there's greater supply of another currency, it'll depreciate relative to, this is greater relative to the other, either demand relative to supply or supply relative to demand. I meant to say a little bit more here, and I realize again, I'll have to come back and do that. Let me take a screenshot here. Good, that was too loud, sorry. Purchasing power parity and its implications. Well, purchasing power parity means currency should buy the same amount of goods in each of the places. I wonder if I had an example down here. I do. I'll talk about this down here. So, supply and demand framework for exchange rate determination under a flexible exchange system. Yeah, again, the key is like how demand and supply compare. If there's greater demand for one currency, it appreciates. If there's greater supply of another currency, it'll depreciate. So for instance, like comparing US dollar demand to Mexican peso demand, the US demand shifts out. If the US interest rates increase relative to Mexico's interest rates, Mexico prices increase relative to U.S. prices. Mexico's taxes increase relative to U.S. taxes. U.S. productivity increase relative to Mexico's productivity, and U.S. tariff decrease relative to Mexico's tariffs. Those are all things that will tend to shift rightward demand for the U.S. dollar. Comparing U.S. dollar supply to Mexican peso supply, U.S. dollar supply shifts out rightward if Mexico's interest rate increases relative to U.S. interest rates, U.S. prices increase relative to Mexico's prices, U.S. taxes increase relative to Mexico's taxes, Mexico's productivity increases relative to U.S. productivity, and U.S. tariffs decrease relative to Mexico's tariffs. So understand why in the demand and supply framework for exchange rates, the supply curve shifts upwards, slopes upward, demand curve slopes downward. Well, currency demand is downward sloping because foreigners want to buy a greater quantity as the local currency depreciates in value. Currency supply is upward sloping because domestic currency holders are willing to supply more of it as the price increases. Implication of appreciation and depreciation on currency and imports and exports. Well, appreciating currency is good for importers, bad for exporters, because it means you can buy more of the relatively cheaper currency. But you can buy less of the relatively more expensive currency. So if the peso depreciates, U.S. importers can buy more Mexican goods. If the dollar appreciates, then Mexican consumers buy less of U.S. goods, which is bad for U.S. exporters. Thinking about like how to convert one currency to another. So suppose a Big Mac is $4 Canadian in Toronto, $3 U.S. dollars in New York City. If the U.S. Canadian dollar exchange rate is $1.33 per U.S. dollar, the two monies have the same value. You could buy a Big Mac either in Toronto or New York City for either $4 Canadian or $3 U.S. If you buy a Big Mac in New York, you either have $3 United States or $4 Canadian. $4 Canadian becomes 4 Canadian times 3 USD per 4 Canadian is 3 USD. If you're buying the Big Mac in Toronto, you either have $4 Canadian or $3 United States dollars, which becomes 3 USD times exchange rate is $4 Canadian. And this gives rise to like think of the relationship with the Big Mac index as well. Let's talk about Big Mac. Remember a few big lessons from economics. So firstly, supply and demand is a powerful tool to describe and predict outcomes. You can get pretty good insight from thinking about supply and demand model and thinking about what we'd expect to happen as a result of fluctuations in each.
And I'm going to conclude this video right here. Obviously, it just loops back. This is where we just left off on question 44. If you've made it to the video, thank you. Hope you enjoyed the video. Sorry for the unusual sort of approach. This is the first time I've ever made a video across like a couple different machines and over the span of a week. I usually like to film them kind of one take and get them right out for people to be useful as soon as possible. But anyway, I hope you liked the video and I wish you the very best with your study.